Well, hello everyone. Welcome to week 7 of EPM 4355, ISO 14001 Environmental Management Systems. This week we're going to learn about operational planning and control and emergency preparedness and response. Once again, we go back to our Plan, Do, Check, Act diagram, and we see that this is the final week of support and operation, the doing. So this week we're really focused on operations, operations control, operations management, mostly in clause 8 and the subclauses of 8 in the 14001 standard. So this gives you an idea of where we are in the class. Operational planning and control is a key part of the standard. It's one of the more flexible parts. In this lecture, we're going to look at the key definitions, the role of operational control, the actual requirements from the standard, and then some methods for documenting operational control. We're also going to do a very brief review of emergency preparedness and response. Again, we'll look at some key definitions and understand the role of emergency preparedness and response in an organization. We'll look at the actual 14001 emergency preparedness and response requirements, and then look at an example of how to document emergency preparedness and response. The important definitions to understand related to operational control are as follows. The first one is outsource. And outsourcing is very common and most people know what it means, but from the ISO standpoint, outsourcing means making an arrangement where an external organization performs part of an organization's function or process. And according to ISO, an external organization is always outside the scope of the management system, although the outsourced function or process is within the scope. That's an interesting distinction because the function or process needs to be included in the aspects and impacts analysis, even though it is outsourced. That's a very important part. That's where many people will miss this when they set up the EMS. So make sure that when you define your aspects and impacts, if you're going to outsource any operations or functions or processes, that you include those in your aspects, impacts, as well as your compliance obligations analysis. From an ISO standpoint, a process is defined as a set of interrelated or interacting activities which transforms inputs into outputs. And we looked at the process model earlier. And remember, within an EMS, a process can be documented or not. There are other controls that you can use on a process other than a documented procedure. And this is where the new generation of management standards from ISO is changing. It's backing off on having everything documented and requiring just a minimum set of documents for an EMS. Life cycle considerations are very important, especially when you do the aspects and impacts analysis and the regulatory compliance analysis, and assess your compliance obligations as well as set your policy and look at some views of interested parties. A good example of this is the control of suppliers in the coffee industry, the fair trade coffee. So for ISO defines a life cycle as consecutive and interlinked stages of a product or service system from raw material acquisition or generation, from resources to final disposal, from cradle to cradle. The life cycle stages include acquisition of raw materials, design, production, transportation and delivery, use, end-of-life treatment, and final disposal. Now it's interesting that in the changes in 2015, the life cycle considerations apply to both products and services. So what is the role of operational control? Why is it important for any organization? Well, operational control in an EMS gives assurance to the managers that the processes, the activities within the organization are effective. They're achieving the results intended. And you can there's many methods that can be used. And the standard really gives managers the flexibility to select the type of operational controls that they want to impose. And this is another major improvement in the standard. Methods of control can include designing a process as to prevent error and ensure consistent results. This is known as mistake proofing. Using technology to control a process and prevent adverse results. This is engineering controls. This is something as simple as a thermostat or your heating system at home. Using competent personnel to ensure the desired results. We train the people and then we let them go and do what they do best. Performing processes in a specified way. That was this is akin to a documented procedure, but it's a defined procedure. So there are certain steps that have to be followed. Monitoring or measuring a process to check the results. This is simply putting some sort of measurement device on a particular process, measuring the physical characteristics that are being generated, and determining the use and amount of documented information necessary. This can be both operating procedures and records. So there's many forms of operational control, and the different forms have different functions, and they play different roles within the organization. They also have different requirements within the EMS. In terms of outsourcing, the organization decides the extent of control within its own business processes. In other words, to control or influence the outsourced processes. And so what this really means is that what it means is that when an organization outsources a particular process, it has to first of all decide what forms of control they want to put on that outsourced process. And if we go back and look at some of the previous ones, we can see, do we want to ensure competent personnel? Do we want to give them documented procedures? Do we want to request the results from measuring the process? That kind of a thing. There's many possible outsourced operations, especially when you consider a life cycle of products and services. You can outsource the design and development of facilities, processes, products, and services. You can outsource the acquisition of raw materials, including extraction. You can outsource certain operational and manufacturing processes. A common one is warehousing. You can outsource the operation and maintenance of facilities, organizational assets, and infrastructure. This is also an emerging area of companies that do nothing but operate and maintain facilities, facilities managers. You can outsource product transportation and service delivery, including packaging. Storage, and use, and end-of-life treatment of products can be outsourced. And finally, a very common one is waste management, including reuse, refurbishing, recycling, and disposal. So we can see that there's many possibilities for outsourcing operations throughout a product and services life cycle. Within an operational control, there are three types conceptually. There's feed forward, concurrent, and feedback. Feed forward controls are active anticipation and prevention of problems rather than just passive reaction when things happen. Concurrent controls are monitoring and adjusting ongoing activities and processes. And feedback control is checking a completed activity and learning from mistakes. In terms of preventing problems, feedback is probably the least useful. In terms of preventing problems, feed forward is the most useful because it really requires that the controls be in place before anything goes wrong. So the feed forward control, if we think of it as monitoring inputs and anticipating and preventing problems, feed forward control is applied to inputs to a particular process. Concurrent control is about monitoring a process and adjusting as ongoing activities. This can be something as simple as a thermostat adjusting the heat in your home. And then feedback control is monitoring products and learning from past mistakes. This might be the report that you get from your local electric company saying how efficiently you used electricity in the past month, that kind of a thing. And that home example, again, feed forward control might be sealing your house and using high efficiency windows, that kind of thing. So from a process standpoint, the three types of controls, the feed forward are applied to inputs, concurrent is applied to the process itself, and feedback is applied to the outputs, and information gained goes back to the process owner from all three of these. Here's the requirements from 14,001. The organization shall establish, implement, control, and maintain the processes needed to meet the environmental management system requirements and to implement the actions identified in 6.1 and 6.2 by establishing operating criteria for the processes and implementing control of the processes in accordance with the operating criteria. Again, controls can take a variety of form. They can include engineering controls, they can include documented procedures, they can be implemented following a hierarchy like elimination, substitution, administrative controls. It can be used individually or in combination. And in terms of process controls, the process controls have to be controlled. So any changes to these controls have to be planned and reviewed, and including the consequences on environmental performance. And the outsourcing requirement is that the organization shall ensure that outsourced processes are controlled or influenced. And then the type and extent of control or influence to be applied to the processes shall be defined within the EMS. So we see here that processes that go on in the organization that have environmental aspects and impacts have to have operating criteria that specify limits and methods for performing the process. And then these operating criteria have to be implemented in order to gain control of the process. And then consistent, this is where we get into the life cycle thinking, because consistent with a life cycle perspective, the organization shall establish controls as appropriate to ensure that its environmental requirements are addressed in a design and development process. That's interesting. This is applying environmental management all the way back before a product ever is fully realized or a service is ever fully realized, and it's still in the design and development phase, considering each life cycle stage. So the design of the product has to be considered from an environmental viewpoint throughout its entire life cycle. And so the organization also has to determine its environmental requirements for procurement of products and services, toxic, non-toxic, that kind of thing, and then communicate its relevant environmental requirements to external providers, including contractors and suppliers, and then consider the need to provide information about potential significant environmental impacts associated with the transportation or delivery, use, end-of-life treatment, and final disposal of its products and services. This is things like disposing properly of lithium batteries, providing a pamphlet in there telling consumers where they can be recycled or why not throw them out. The second part of this is that the organization shall maintain documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned. Again, you don't have to have a documented procedure per se, but there needs to be some form of documented information that clearly states that the processes that are being controlled within the organization have been carried out as planned according to the criteria that have been identified. Probably the toughest one here is going to be design and development. As many organizations are not implementing design for the environment. The EPA has a whole program around this, but many organizations that have not done it are going to have to do it if they wish to remain certified to 14,001 for the 2015 revision. Here's a way of documenting operational control. We first start with our significant environmental aspects. We look at the indicators, the actual scales, the associated job functions, who's doing it, what exists already, what needs to be developed or modifications, and then who's responsible for doing uh, both the job and their modifications, and then where the location is posted for any procedures or documented information. So emergency preparedness and response. This is a very critical area in any organization. And at its heart, emergency preparedness is about risk. ISO defines risk as the effect of uncertainty. An effect is a deviation from the expected, both positive or negative. And uncertainty is a state, even partial, of deficiency of information related to understanding or knowledge of an event, its consequence, or likelihood. And so uncertainty is you just simply do not know what's going on about a particular event or its consequences or its likelihood. In ISO Guide 73, risk is characterized by reference to potential events and consequences, a combination of these. And risk is many times, for you guys who have been involved in risk management, I'm sure you know this, the risk is often expressed in terms of a combination of the consequences of an event, including changes in circumstances, and the associated likelihood or probability. From a preparedness and response viewpoint, it's important to understand impacts. Again, impacts are changes or change to the environment, whether adverse or beneficial, wholly or partially resulting from an organization's environmental aspects, the drivers of change. The focus of risk management in any organization is the assessment of significant risks and the implementation of suitable risk responses. And this is the case for every form of risk that exists. And in EMS, emergency preparedness is a component of organizational risk management. And so from the environmental viewpoint, emergency preparedness is an appropriate risk management strategy. What you want to do in terms of managing risk from an emergency preparedness viewpoint is to identify the scope and nature of risks, classify them, look at the time scale, the potential impacts, identify the likelihood and magnitude of events and possible impacts or consequences, identify the loss potential and anticipated operational financial impacts of the risks, and identify risk response, treatment, and controls. Now these bullet items can be applied to all forms of risk. And so they are applicable to environmental emergencies. This is an overview of risk management in any organization. We can see that the diagram has a couple of aspects to it. First of all, within the ellipse are internally driven risks, and then outside are externally driven risks, changes and events emerging from the external environment. So this is similar to our systems diagram we looked at earlier. And we can see that risks are financial risks, strategic risks in terms of operational strategies, operational risks from performing the activities within the organization, and then hazard risks. And this is where environmental management comes in because it concerns hazardous conditions generated from natural events or changes in the environment, or perhaps toxic materials from suppliers and contracts that provide for hazardous conditions. And so the main thrust of emergency preparedness or response is both internally driven and externally driven risks. And so we want to understand what's happening here, and this is where emergency preparedness and response processes take place. They're really not too much concerned with operational risks and financial risks and strategic risks, although as a part of an overall organizational risk management approach, emergency preparedness and response processes within EMS are very important. They're one of the cornerstones. So emergency preparedness or response has a couple of a couple of areas that an organization should look at. First of all, they should consider what's the most appropriate method for responding to an emergency situation. Do this for a variety of situations. What are the internal and external communication processes during that situation? And what actions are required to prevent or mitigate environmental impacts in that particular situation? And again, consider different types of emergency situations. What are we going to do to mitigate and respond for different emergency scenarios? We should consider the need for post-emergency evaluation to determine and implement corrective actions. This is, again, feedback. And then periodic testing, consider this to make sure that these things actually work as they're defined. Training of emergency response personnel so everybody knows what to do and what the roles are and how to perform during an emergency. Providing a list of key personnel and aid agencies, including contact details. This is very straightforward. Fire departments, cleanup services, that kind of thing. Evacuation routes and assembly points for those people internal to the organization working in facilities. And then the possibility of mutual assistance from neighboring organizations. Can we all get together here and maybe provide shelter in the case of perhaps a building fire or something like that if it's raining outside or if it's during inclement weather. So what are the emergency preparedness and response requirements? They're relatively straightforward. Again, the standard requires that the organization establish, implement, and maintain the processes to both prepare for and respond to emergency situations. So it's preparation and response. So the organization shall prepare to respond by planning actions to prevent or mitigate adverse environmental impacts from emergency situations. This is where most organizations fall down. They don't really go through an extensive planning. They don't consider all the possibilities, and especially they don't consider how to mitigate the adverse environmental impacts from possible situations. The organization shall respond to actual emergency situations and then take action to prevent or mitigate the consequences of emergency situations, appropriate to the magnitude of the emergency and the potential environmental impact. And these are, this is what is to be done in the case of emergencies. These plans need to be tested because they're only as good as they can be implemented. Where practicable, it's not always practical to test these plans. And the organization should periodically review and revise the processes and plan response actions, especially after the occurrence of an emergency situation or a test, sort of implementing lessons learned, feedback controls. And then provide relevant information and training to related emergency preparedness and response, related to emergency preparedness and response to relevant interested parties. This would be things like the community, what's going to happen, how the company prepares to respond in case there's a fire or a release of chemicals, that kind of thing, including the people working under its control. So even though you may not be involved in an emergency, the organization may inform you of what the potential impacts are, potential mitigation, and what's going to be happening during an emergency. And the organization shall maintain documented information, again, to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes are carried out as planned. So these 6 processes need to be documented just to the extent necessary. It doesn't mean you have to have a documented situation. However, most organizations will have an emergency preparedness and response plan. Again, ISO offers some flexibility here for smaller organizations. And so, again, it's up to the management to decide what is the extent necessary that so we have confidence that these 6 processes are carried out as planned. Here's a way to document emergency preparedness and response. And this is for a potential emergency scenario. You look at what are the potential impacts, what actions are required to deal with these impacts, what procedures do we need to take these actions that will control these actions, And what training do we need so that people know how to implement these procedures? It's a very straightforward approach to documenting emergency preparedness and response. Well, that's it for this week's lecture. If you have any questions, ask them in the instructor office threads. Send me an email, leave me a voicemail, and we'll see you online.